The reading is from the first chapter of James and the first 8 verses. James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes in the dispersion, greetings. My brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of any kind, consider it nothing but joy, because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its full effect, so that you may be mature and complete, lacking in nothing. If any of you is lacking in wisdom, ask God, who gives to all generously and ungrudgingly, and it will be given you. But ask in faith, never doubting. For the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For the doubter, being double-minded and unstable in every way, must not expect to receive anything from the Lord. The word of the Lord. You may be seated. Don't be surprised if sometime about noon you hear a news report of slight seismic activity in East Central Germany, Wittenberg in particular, the old castle church. Martin Luther was rolling over in his grave as I read James 1, and we just sang his famous hymn, A Mighty Fortress. Martin Luther, as many of you know, did not think very highly of our epistle that we will be working through this semester. The 20th century in particular, scholars followed Luther and did not read James very often. More recently, scholars are giving more attention to the legitimacy of James and its place in the Christian canon and its message for us. It's interesting to me in this irony of singing Luther's hymn and then reading this text that underlying the theology behind A Mighty Fortress is much of what we read in the text that I just read a moment ago. That God will sustain us, that our faith in Him, He will provide for us and carry us through. Throughout James, there is an emphasis on trials and temptations. We read about it in verse 2. We'll read about it again in verse 12 next week. Blessed is anyone who endures temptation. Such a one has stood the test and will receive the crown of life the Lord has promised to those who love Him. And then again, we pick up this theme of trial and temptation in chapter 5, verses 7 and 8. Be patient, therefore, beloved, until the coming of the Lord. The farmer waits for the precious crop from the earth, being patient with it until it receives the early and the late rains. You also must be patient. Strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is near. And then chapter 5, verses 17 through 20. Elijah was a human being like us, and he prayed fervently that it might not rain. And for 3 years and 6 months, it did not rain on the earth. I think he's been in Austin lately. Then he prayed again, and the heaven gave rain, and the earth yielded its harvest. Endurance. It's not the set jaw, the stern face endurance that James is talking about, but neither is it the vapid, cheery, don't worry, be happy, everything will be okay. It's tough times for these Christians. And James is talking to them about these tough times, and he says, count it all joy. Because if you endure, it's going to help your faith mature, and if your faith continues to mature, you will be mature. Some translations will read perfect and complete, looking toward the end. And there's that need for wisdom. If you don't understand this, he says, just pray for it. And we get this picture of God not as a harsh, mean, judgmental God, but this picture of God who is ready to deliver and ready to teach us and to help us so that we do endure and mature and become complete It will be tested even by fire. Back to A Mighty Fortress. And I guess we ought to do some literary criticism on that as well. Your version, Mark, just has 3 verses. The one I worked through has 4 verses. And if we go back and look at the history of it, there's debate about whether Luther actually read or wrote the 4th verse, but we won't go into those details right now. But I'm going to be looking at the one with 4 verses for just a moment. Another irony. At the St. John's Abbey in Minnesota a number of years ago, there was a hymn fest. And it was primarily Catholics there, in particular, primarily Benedictine monks. And in the hymn fest, they sang A Mighty Fortress, the battle hymn of the Reformation, as it's been called, in a Catholic setting. But what they were instructed to do that day was that the congregation would just sing verses 1 and 2 and 4. At verse 3, the organist would have a solo. And look at verse 3. And though this world with demons filled, I think the translation we work from says evil filled, should threaten to undo us, we will not fear, for God hath willed His truth to triumph through us. The prince of darkness grim, we tremble not for him. His rage we can endure, for lo, his doom is sure. One little word will fail him. What the organist did in that 3rd verse, where evil is the emphasis, was to do what was called a cacophony of dissonance, discordant. And the way it was described was that it sounded like downtown Manhattan traffic, foot traffic, vehicle traffic, harsh voices, a lot of yelling, brakes squealing, horns honking, just all the harshness of it. And then the congregation would come back into the melody in verse 4, where this hope of God's victory comes through. Now, we don't have an organ here today, so we could not do that. We could have come close to it, though. Professor Napier already knows what is happening. If Professor Shipp had said, the congregation will sing verses 1 and 2, and Professor Shipp and President Reid will sing verse 3 as a duet, you would have gotten some sense of this discordant unharmony that would be going on. But we did not do that. Back to that melody of verse 4, though. One word will fell the devil, the evil one. Probably Jesus Christ is that word. And He is what gives us our endurance. Kathleen Norris made a journey from faith, out of faith, back to faith. She was in the art scene in New York City during the 1960s. She experienced all of that so-called freedom. And in that freedom, she found herself in decadence. She had gone to a place called the Sanctuary that was basically a gay hangout. She was not gay. She did not really feel that she fit there that evening. But the Sanctuary was a desacralized church. And she said anything in the world could go on in that setting. And in that conversation with some people there that evening, she said she realized, I don't belong, but I'm trying to live in 2 worlds. The double-mindedness that James talks about. And she said she went home, and the next day, that afternoon, she started thinking about a word she had not thought about in a long time, and that was the word sin. And she thought about conscience. And she thought it had been an appendage that was no longer needed, and she said maybe mine was lying there dormant. But she said, what I heard that afternoon was a voice. And it was the voice of my Presbyterian grandmother back in North Dakota. She ultimately moved back there and started trying to find her way back into faith. And she said as she listened to the Christian vocabulary, words like eschatology, it left her exhausted. But what I appreciated about her as a seeker, she said, I didn't expect the church to change its language for me. as I was making my way back into the faith, I realized that I needed to learn this vocabulary. And she wrote a book called Amazing Grace. The subtitle is A Vocabulary of Faith, and it's a sort of lexicon of Christian words that she has worked with and dealt with, written at the lay level. But in that book, it's interesting to me that the first Christian word that she chooses to develop is the word eschatology, the end things. And James has a lot of eschatology in it, talking about trials and temptations and the end things and the struggle that goes on. And she unpacked eschatology, though. She came to a story that she remembered. A friend of hers, a young scholar, promising career ahead of her, was stricken with cancer. 3 times it recurred, finally remission. And as she was struggling through that, she talked to her department head and said, "I'd never want to go back to how it was, because I know what each morning means. I am grateful to just be alive." And the chair said, "We've been through so much together in the last few years." And the teacher said, "Yes, and hasn't it been a blessing?" Count it all joy, my brothers and sisters, when you experience trials of various kinds. Let God work in that as you endure. Let Him make you complete and mature and even perfect. The Christian life is a progression. And just as Kathleen Norris learned, it takes a vocabulary to get through it. The vocabulary points us to the one who, as this text shows us, loves us and is ready to give us what we need to make us ready for that kingdom that we look forward to coming. And may we be ready and prepared as we together make that journey. The word of the Lord.